Okay, ready to dive in? We're taking a deep look at Antony Beevor's D-Day, the Battle for Normandy.
It's really not your typical military history book.
Definitely not. It's meticulously researched, and it goes way beyond just the strategies and the battles.
Absolutely. Beevor really connects the dots between those big decisions in the war rooms and their impact on the people on the ground, both soldiers and civilians.
Yeah, he makes you feel like you're right there in the thick of it. It's like history with a heartbeat, you know?
Exactly. And one of the things that Beevor highlights right from the start is the sheer scale of the deception involved in Operation Fortitude.
Operation Fortitude.
Yeah.
That was the Allied plan to mislead the Germans about the real invasion plans, right?
Exactly. It was a multifaceted operation, with Fortitude North targeting Norway and Fortitude South aiming at the Pas de Calais.
The Pas de Calais. That's the area of France closest to England, so it makes sense that the Germans would think that's where the main attack would come.
Right. And the Allies went to extraordinary lengths to reinforce that belief. They created dummy equipment, inflatable tanks, even fake radio traffic to make it seem like a massive force was poised to strike there.
It's mind-boggling to think about the level of detail and planning that went into this deception.
It was a truly massive undertaking, and it worked. The Germans were convinced that the main attack would come at Pas de Calais, leaving Normandy relatively lightly defended.
Which, of course, was exactly what the Allies were hoping for. But the success of D-Day didn't just hinge on deception. Beevor also sheds light on the crucial role played by personalities like Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces.
Eisenhower had the incredibly challenging task of managing a team of very strong-willed individuals, each with their own ideas and ambitions. He had to balance those personalities and somehow forge them into a cohesive fighting force.
It's like herding cats, almost.
In a way, yes. And one of the most colorful figures in Beevor's book is General Patton, known for his bold tactics and his rather unconventional leadership style.
Oh, Patton. He was a real character, wasn't he?
To say the least, Beevor gives you a real sense of Patton's personality with this anecdote where he's rallying his troops.
What did he say?
He said, "No bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. You win it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country."
Wow. Not exactly politically correct, but I guess that was Patton. Straight to the point.
It gives you a sense of his style, very blunt, very direct, and maybe that's what resonated with the soldiers under his command.
Yeah, I can see how that kind of in-your-face approach might have appealed to some people in that situation, facing the unknown, about to embark on this incredibly dangerous mission.
It also highlights the diverse range of leadership styles at play within the Allied command and the challenges Eisenhower faced in keeping everyone on the same page.
And on top of all that, you have the immense pressure and danger of the operation itself. Beevor recounts this really tense episode involving a secret reconnaissance mission to Omaha Beach.
This mission focused on Captain Scott Bowden and Sergeant Ogden Smith. They were part of a British team tasked with secretly assessing Omaha Beach to see if it was suitable for tanks.
Suitable for tanks?
Yeah, it was a crucial piece of the puzzle. They needed to know if the tanks would be able to operate effectively on the beach or if they'd get bogged down.
So how did they do it?
They swam ashore under cover of darkness, armed only with knives and pistols. They gathered soil samples, trying to avoid detection the whole time.
That must have been nerve-wracking.
Absolutely. If they had been caught, it would have meant capture or worse. But their findings proved incredibly valuable. They foreshadowed the difficulties the Americans would face on Omaha, the fierce resistance they would encounter.
It really highlights the meticulous planning and the bravery that went into even the smallest aspects of this huge operation.
Absolutely, every detail mattered. And speaking of bravery, Beevor's account of the airborne assault that took place before the D-Day landings is absolutely gripping.
The paratroopers, they had to secure key objectives behind enemy lines. Can you imagine the pressure they must have been under, jumping into the unknown in the dead of night?
Beevor captures that feeling of anxiety and uncertainty brilliantly. He tells the story about a priest giving a sermon to the paratroopers just before they board their planes.
A sermon? What kind of sermon?
Apparently, the priest focused on sin and mortality, preparing them for the possibility of death.
Oh, wow.
It had a profound effect on the men. Beevor says that many of them discarded their condoms, fearing they might die with the means of mortal sin on them.
That's a powerful image. They're facing their own mortality, thinking about the meaning of their actions.
It really humanizes these young men, makes you realize they were just kids, many of them, facing this incredible challenge. And Beevor contrasts that experience with the daring glider mission led by Major John Howard.
What was their objective?
They were tasked with capturing the bridges over the Orne River, a vital objective for the British forces.
Sounds incredibly dangerous.
It was. The stealth and precision required for this mission were remarkable. And Beevor compares this experience to the anxiety felt by the Canadian paratroopers.
They were anxious?
Initially, yes. But Beevor highlights how, under Brigadier Hill's leadership, they displayed incredible courage once they landed under heavy fire.
It's amazing how people can adapt and overcome, even in the most extreme circumstances.
It really is. But Beevor doesn't just focus on the Allied perspective. He also delves into the German side of the story, providing valuable insight into their anxieties and uncertainties in the days leading up to the invasion.
I bet they were on edge, knowing an attack was coming, but not knowing where or when.
Absolutely. Beevor draws on letters and diaries of German soldiers, giving us a glimpse into their mindset. There's a sense of dread and anticipation, a feeling that something big is about to happen, but they're in the dark about the specifics.
I can only imagine. They must have felt powerless, almost.
Yeah.
Especially with a constant threat of Allied bombing raids.
Exactly. Those bombing raids were relentless, causing heavy casualties and disrupting their communications.
So, the Allied air superiority played a decisive role in the outcome of the battle.
Without a doubt. It hampered the German ability to coordinate their defenses and react effectively to the landings.
It's a reminder that air power, while often overlooked, was a crucial factor in the Allied victory.
But that air power, while vital for the Allied success, also came at a terrible cost, particularly for civilians caught in the crossfire. Beevor doesn't shy away from this. He dedicates a lot of attention to the devastating consequences of the bombing raids, particularly on the city of Cannes.
Cannes, that was a major strategic objective, wasn't it?
It was. But the bombing raids caused widespread destruction, reducing homes and infrastructure to rubble. Hundreds of innocent civilians lost their lives. Beevor shares some really poignant accounts from survivors describing the terror and chaos they endured.
It's a stark reminder that the cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield.
Absolutely. And the bombing of Cannes has been the subject of much debate, with some critics arguing that the raids were ineffective in achieving their military objectives and caused disproportionate civilian suffering.
It raises those difficult ethical questions about the cost of liberation, the balancing act between strategic necessity and the imperative to minimize civilian casualties.
It's a testament to Beevor's skill as a historian that he presents these complex issues without offering easy answers or passing judgment. He lets the reader grapple with the moral dilemmas inherent in war.
It's about understanding the complexities, not simplifying them. And while Beevor confronts us with the tragic aspects of war, he also highlights the crucial role intelligence played in shaping the course of events, particularly through the Allies' groundbreaking code-breaking operation, Ultra.
Ultra. Imagine having access to your enemy's most sensitive communications. That's exactly what Ultra provided.
It's like reading their mail, essentially.
In a way, yes. This intelligence was invaluable. It gave the Allies a crucial edge, allowing them to anticipate German troop movements, defensive strategies, all sorts of vital information.
So Ultra wasn't just about deciphering messages. It was about using that knowledge to outmaneuver the enemy, to anticipate their next move and counter it effectively.
Precisely. And Beevor provides some compelling examples of key intercepts that directly influenced the course of the battle, shaping decisions made by Allied commanders.
It's fascinating to see how intelligence gathering played such a vital role behind the scenes.
Absolutely. And then there's the bocage, this incredibly challenging terrain that became a defining feature of the fighting in Normandy.
The bocage.
The bocage refers to the Normandy countryside. Think dense hedgerows, ancient earthen embankments, thickets of trees and shrubs, all crisscrossing the landscape.
Sounds beautiful.
It is, in a way, but for the soldiers fighting there, it was a nightmare. It favored the defenders, made tank warfare incredibly difficult, and created a very claustrophobic and disorienting environment.
I can imagine it must have felt like fighting in a maze.
That's a good way to put it. Beevor describes these hedgerows as veritable walls of vegetation, sometimes reaching heights of 15 feet or more.
Wow. So the soldiers couldn't see very far ahead of them.
Exactly, and they were constantly on edge, fearing ambushes from every direction.
It must have taken a heavy psychological toll fighting in those conditions. The constant fear, the exhaustion, the uncertainty.
Absolutely, and Beevor delves into that psychological strain. He talks about soldiers struggling with what was then called battle fatigue, a condition we now know as PTSD.
PTSD. We
Yeah.
know a lot more about that now, but back then it wasn't really understood or acknowledged, was it?
Unfortunately not. It was often dismissed as a weakness, a lack of moral fiber, and that lack of understanding had tragic consequences for many soldiers.
It's a reminder that the wounds of war aren't always visible, and sometimes the battle for recovery continues long after the fighting ends.
And Beevor doesn't shy away from acknowledging the atrocities that were committed on both sides, the darker side of human nature that war can unleash.
It's important to remember that war isn't just about heroism and strategy. It's about the very real and often brutal consequences for everyone involved.
He talks about the massacre of Canadian prisoners by soldiers of the Hitler Jugend Division, a chilling example of the brutality that can erupt in the heat of battle.
And on the Allied side, there were instances of revenge killings fueled by grief and anger.
It's a difficult truth to confront, but it's crucial to understanding the full spectrum of the war's impact. It wasn't black and white. It was filled with shades of gray.
And amidst all this darkness, Beevor also highlights the moments of humanity, the acts of compassion that defied the dehumanizing nature of war.
He talks about the medics who risked their lives to care for the wounded, regardless of which side they fought for.
And the truces that were sometimes arranged, those brief moments of respite where both sides set aside their weapons to collect their dead and wounded.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of the most horrific violence, there are glimmers of hope, of shared humanity that transcend the divisions of war.
It's those moments that make you believe in the possibility of peace, even in the darkest of times.
And Beevor doesn't just focus on the soldiers. He weaves in the experiences of ordinary people, civilians caught in the crossfire, whose lives were irrevocably altered by the events of D-Day and the subsequent battles.
It's easy to forget about the impact on the civilian population caught in the middle of this conflict. Their homes destroyed, their lives disrupted, their sense of security shattered.
Beevor paints a vivid picture of their experiences. The displacement, the destruction, the trauma, the long and arduous process of rebuilding their lives.
The reminder that the impact of war extends far beyond the battlefield.
Absolutely. And Beevor goes on to explore the complexities of the post-liberation period.
It wasn't just a simple matter of the Allies winning and everything going back to normal, was it?
Not at all. There were challenges of rebuilding a nation shattered by war, the political divisions that reemerged, the lingering resentments, the suspicions, the scars that remained long after the fighting ended.
It's like the aftershocks of an earthquake, the tremors that continue long after the initial shock.
It's a reminder that victory, while a cause for celebration, doesn't erase the complexities and the challenges that linger in the aftermath of war.
And that's what makes Beevor's book so compelling. It's not just a military history, it's a story about people, about their experiences, their struggles, their triumphs, their losses.
It's a book that challenges our assumptions and forces us to confront the complexities of war.
And ultimately, it's a call to remembrance, a reminder of the sacrifices made to secure freedom and a challenge to future generations to learn from the mistakes of the past.
It's a book that deserves to be read and reread, a powerful and moving testament to the enduring human spirit and a stark reminder of the fragility of peace.
You know, one thing that really gets me is how Beevor can go from talking about this huge operation to suddenly you're right there with the soldier landing on the beach. Like he talks about the experience of the troops as they're approaching the beaches on D-Day, witnessing this just massive naval bombardment.
It's hard to even imagine what that must have been like, to experience that kind of overwhelming force.
Beevor uses this really vivid comparison. He describes the shells from the battleships roaring overhead like freight cars. Can you imagine?
Like car? The noise, the vibrations, this sense of just raw power being unleashed.
And all this while they're crammed inside those landing craft, battling seasickness, facing the unknown.
Yeah, right. They can't see much of anything. They're just surrounded by helmets and anticipation.
It must have been incredibly intense.
And then, of course, they had to contend with the German defenses on the beaches.
Which weren't exactly welcoming in some places.
Definitely not, especially on Omaha Beach, where the Americans faced really heavy casualties. Beevor actually talks about Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of President Roosevelt.
Right, I remember reading about it. He landed on Utah Beach, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And what's remarkable is that he was in pretty poor health at the time, even needing a cane to walk. But despite that, he rallied his men under intense fire, showed real leadership and courage.
He was later awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions that day.
He was. It's a powerful example of that human capacity for resilience, even in the most extreme circumstances.
And Beevor doesn't just focus on the big names. He brings in the stories of all these ordinary soldiers, medics, engineers who are facing the horrors of combat, day after day.
And it wasn't just the physical danger. He talks about the immense psychological strain of prolonged combat, the exhaustion, the fear, the sheer terror,
He even mentions the phenomenon of battle fatigue, which we now call PTSD.
which sadly wasn't well understood at the time.
It was often seen as a weakness, right? Rather than a consequence of the trauma these men were experiencing.
Sadly, many of them didn't get the support and understanding that they needed.
It's a reminder that the wounds of war aren't always visible.
Exactly. And Beevor doesn't shy away from the darker aspects of war either. The atrocities, the moments where morality breaks down.
He talks about the massacre of Canadian prisoners by soldiers of the Hitler-Jugend Division.
It's a chilling example of how war can dehumanize, how it can unleash this incredible brutality.
And there were instances of revenge killings by Allied soldiers, too.
Driven by grief and rage, it's a difficult truth to confront, but it's part of the complex reality of war.
It's not all black and white, hero versus villain. It's much more complicated than that.
Beevor doesn't shy away from those complexities. He shows war in all its shades of gray.
And even amidst all the darkness, he finds those glimmers of humanity.
The medics risking their lives to care for the wounded, the truces arranged to collect the dead, those moments where compassion shines through.
It makes you wonder how people can hold on to those shreds of humanity in such a brutal environment.
It's remarkable, isn't it? And Beevor doesn't just focus on the soldiers. He brings in the experiences of the civilians, the people caught in the crossfire.
Whose lives were completely upended by the war.
He talks about the displacement, the destruction, the trauma, the long and difficult process of rebuilding.
It's easy to forget about the civilian cost of war.
It's a crucial part of the story. And Beevor also explores the complexities of the post-liberation period.
Which was far from simple.
It wasn't just about the Allies winning and everything going back to normal.
There were so many challenges. Rebuilding a society, dealing with political divisions, and lingering resentment.
It's like the aftershocks of an earthquake.
Those tremors that continue long after the initial event.
Beevor reminds us that victory doesn't erase the past. It doesn't solve everything.
And that's what makes his book so valuable. He gives us this nuanced and unflinching look at war.
He challenges our assumptions and shows us the full picture.
The good and the bad, the heroism and the brutality.
It's not an easy read, but it's a necessary one.
And it's one that will stay with you long after you finish the last page. You know, it's amazing how Beevor can pull back from these big sweeping narratives, and then boom, you're right there with a soldier in a landing craft.
It's like he's got the zoom lens. He can show you the whole panorama of battle and then zero in on these incredibly personal moments.
Like those soldiers huddled together, hearing those shells screaming overhead.
It must have been absolutely terrifying, knowing that at any moment they could be facing German guns on the beach.
And yet, amidst all that fear and chaos, Beevor finds these moments of humanity.
Those acts of courage and compassion that somehow manage to survive in this incredibly brutal environment.
He talks about the medics who risked their own lives to save others, both Allied and German soldiers.
And those truces that were sometimes arranged where both sides would stop fighting just for a little while to collect their dead and wounded.
It's almost hard to believe that something like that could happen in the middle of such intense fighting.
It makes you realize that even in the darkest of times, there's still this capacity for empathy and compassion.
And it's not just the soldiers. Beevor also talks about the incredible resilience of the civilians who were caught in the crossfire.
The people whose homes were destroyed, whose lives were turned upside down, they faced unimaginable hardships, but they somehow found the strength to keep going.
It's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, the human spirit can endure.
And that's really what Beevor's book is all about. It's about capturing those complexities, the shades of gray that are often missing from our understanding of war.
He doesn't shy away from the dark side, the atrocities, the brutality. But he also finds those moments of hope, those glimmers of humanity that make you believe that peace is possible, even amidst all the chaos and destruction.
He challenges our assumptions and makes us think about war in a new way.
And I think that's why it's so important to read books like this. To remember what happened, to honor the sacrifices that were made.
And to learn from the mistakes of the past.
If you're looking for a truly immersive and thought-provoking exploration of D-Day and the Battle for Normandy, I can't recommend Antony Beevor's book enough.
It's a powerful and moving testament to the enduring human spirit.
It will stay with you long after you finish the last page. You'll find a link to buy the book using our affiliate link in the show notes.
We highly recommend checking it out.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Antony Beevor's D-Day, the Battle for Normandy.